Good evening. My name is Vaughan Smith. I'm the founder of the Frontline Club. And tonight we're going to be talking about what's next for Julian Assange. And we're extremely lucky because we've got Stella Morris here, who is a lawyer who used to be part of Julian, well, still is part of Julian's legal team and is now his fiancée. So it's particularly knowledgeable on the subject and on the whole legal processes. And we've got Rebecca Vincent, who is the director of international campaigns at Reporters Sans Frontières, who used to be a diplomat, is a writer, and is on a mouthful of human rights panels, and so knows exactly what she's talking about. So we're extremely lucky. So thank you for coming tonight. We're broadcasting online as well. There's a significantly bigger audience out there too. We've got apologies from Christian Harafsen, who was going to be online and linked in, but I'm afraid he's unwell. So anybody who was hoping to hear from him, I'm sorry to disappoint you. As for myself, I'm proud to call myself a friend of Julian Assange. We do not have a panel here. None of us would like to see Julian Assange in prison for a single more day. So I'd like to say that. We're not going to be arguing about that, though we're very welcome to take any questions that you may have. This is really about trying to understand what's going on, what the future of Julian Assange is, what are the issues on the case. Now, I'm the founder of the Frontline Club, but I'm not here to represent an institution. I'm here to represent myself. I don't speak for necessarily other members of the Frontline Club. But I have found that increasingly journalists are getting worried about this case in a way that perhaps British journalists weren't so sympathetic in the past. So I'm going to make a start. And I'd like to first start. We're going to do this in a conversational way, but we'll be talking for 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions if you've got any questions, and we'll try and do the best we can to answer those. So I'd like to start and ask Stella if she could give us an outline of the legal process, what's happening. But before she does that, could you please tell us, Stella saw Julian today. Stella went and saw him with Julian's father. And I think we'd all like to have some update on how Julian is, his health first. But if you could then lead on and perhaps explain an outline of the background of the legal situation and what's actually happening.
Thanks, Ron. Yes, I had an afternoon visit at Belmarsh, which is always a very depressing setting for a visit. Every time I see Julian, he's worse. He's thinner. He's just looks really unwell. He looks unlike himself. And I'm really worried about him. I'm really worried that that his health will reach a crisis point, and there will be irreversible damage. And I mean, every day that passes is damage on Julian's physical health. It's not just about his mental health. You know, it's an environment where you're in a cell for many hours a day, and he's on medication, and it's been over 2.5 years now, and he's a very strong person, but we're only human, and it's really taking its toll on him. But you know, it's still Julian's he's not incapacitated, but he's very, very deteriorated. And, you know, he draws his strength from his ability to see me and the kids and his father, from being able to, from learning about, you know, there's a lot of support every day. There's something new. The Austrian Journalists Club just yesterday, I think, gave him the Karl Renner Prize, which is very prestigious in Austria. Last week, the German Pen gave him honorary membership. So there are a lot of shows of support, and those are really important. And if anyone watching has access to nominating Julian for awards, it's a very effective way of showing support and raising awareness about his case. In terms of the case, I mean, it's a political case. The actual mechanics and procedures underway are almost irrelevant. Julian's freedom will be determined by the political climate and the political understanding of what this case really means. We had, just to recap a little bit, the grand jury against WikiLeaks began in early 2010, months before Julian ever went to Sweden. And during the Obama administration, they were looking into ways to prosecute Julian and WikiLeaks because he had angered the military, obviously. He had angered elements of the US administration, but other elements of the Obama administration pushed back. And ultimately, there was a decision, political decision, that this was fatal for the First Amendment, that it was extremely dangerous to indict Julian for publishing information that to the public, true information, and that this would set a precedent that would be then used against the rest of the press. And that's because the will to use the Espionage Act in order to fatally undermine the First Amendment in the United States has been there for at least 50 years. It was there in the attempt to prevent the Pentagon Papers from being published. And it's been a constant throughout the administrations because there are elements within the US administration that don't want such a strong First Amendment. So that's from the US perspective. Under the Obama administration, and I realize I'm going into a lot of detail here, but just in terms of the arc, the Obama administration ultimately decided not to indict Julian over the Chelsea Manning leaks. And Obama commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence. That was a clear political signal that this finished now. Under Trump, this politically motivated persecution was initiated, and it was initiated as a result of WikiLeaks publications, WikiLeaks publishing of specifically, we've learned recently, of Vault 7, the biggest leak in CIA history, which in a nutshell, WikiLeaks exposed the illegal surveillance that the CIA was carrying out in a similar way to how the equivalent of what Snowden had done for the NSA. The difference between Snowden in 2013 and WikiLeaks in 2017 was that WikiLeaks revelations were about the CIA, and the CIA isn't the NSA. With Snowden, the NSA didn't even have a PR department. The CIA has a massive propaganda unit with its tentacles into various media organizations, an ability to plant information in the public domain, and a track record of doing so. That's no secret. It has a rendition program, it has a torture program, it has a kill program. And under Pompeo, there was a recent incredible bombshell story about how Pompeo decided to deploy the full extent of the capacities of the CIA to try to finally incapacitate Julian, including planning to assassinate him inside the embassy, kidnap him, rendition him, and roll out an enormous propaganda effort, planting stories. And that's what we saw from 2016 2017, but especially from 2018 onwards, there were dozens and dozens of false stories culminating in the Guardian front page story about Paul Manafort visiting the embassy on 3 separate occasions. And there was just an incredible lack of journalistic standards when it came to reporting about Julian and WikiLeaks, and a willful misrepresentation. And this has to do with what was going on in the CIA and their effort to propagandize against WikiLeaks, and we can go into that, but basically pave the way for his arrest, to reduce support for him, to try to put an enormous question mark over WikiLeaks motivations, about Julian's motivations, etc., to undermine him to such an extent that it would be politically possible to go into the embassy and forcefully remove a political asylee from an embassy and arrest him. And the moment he was arrested, it was revealed that the US had an indictment, a sealed indictment, that at that moment of his arrest became unsealed. And for the past over 2.5 years, what we've seen is that this extradition request has been progressing through the UK courts. And even though it's a completely outrageous attack on the freedom of the press, it sets an incredibly dangerous precedent for everyone globally. It's not just the First Amendment. The UK and the US have a very treaty which allows the US to bring a case without having to show any prima facie evidence, without having to show that it really has a case. All they need to say is, we want him, basically. And the case has been falling apart. And especially since the summer, with the CIA story, with the fact that their star witness has recanted his testimony, everything related to the computer charges is baseless, that they've misled the DOJ has misled the British courts, because in her ruling, she repeatedly cites the allegations in relation to this star witness who has now recanted those allegations. So the case is completely hopeless, but the structure is heavily favors the United States. And so we have a situation where Julian is languishing in Belmarsh prison. Every day that passes is a serious threat to his life. And the appeal, the US lost in January, and the US appealed. It lodged its appeal 2 days before the Trump administration left office. The DOJ could drop this at any moment. There are different factions in the US government, some pushing for, some pushing against Julian's freedom. And in the meantime, Julian remains imprisoned, and we're expecting a decision. So the US appeal was on the 27th and 28th of October. We're expecting a decision within weeks, most likely before Christmas.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, you have taken a leadership role as a human rights advocate, along with Reporters Sans Frontières. Could you explain to us why it is so important to you, and why this is incredibly important? I mean, you've described it as going to set the trend globally. You've described it as the most important case on national security reporting of our times, if I'm quoting you right.
Of course. I mean, it's. I have to say, in my 16-year career, it's the biggest case, the most complicated case, and the most, I think, the case with the most long-lasting implications that I've ever worked on. I think what happens here will change the future of journalism one way or the other. What has happened to Julian Assange over the past 11 years already has had a chilling effect. So we should be very clear about that. We already will not know the stories that haven't been told because of what this man has gone through. Very few people would be willing to face arbitrary detention at the Ecuadorian embassy for so many years, and then of course being held in a high security prison for 2.5 years now with no and immediately in sight. Okay. What happens next will be historical. If the US is successful in extraditing Julian Assange and prosecuting him there, he will be the first publisher prosecuted under the Espionage Act. It lacks a public interest defense, which means that nobody in this position could defend themselves, because of course that's the defense, is that this information was in the public interest. We fully believe that at Reporters Without Borders, that Julian Assange has been targeted for his contributions to journalism, that this information was in the public interest. It is undoubtable that it informed scores of public interest reporting in countries around the world. So mainstream media organizations that are still reporting stories that are drawing on this information, in theory, could be prosecuted in the same way if this precedent is set. It is really alarming. So we have taken this up. I work on it as Director of International Campaigns because it is one of our top global priorities in the entire world. And I actually do think that this will be the defining case of our generation. We have had a hell of a time monitoring as well. I want to work that in before we go much further. Just
I was going to ask you about that.
This is, oh, I'm sorry if I jumped ahead. I did not look at your notes, Vaughn, for the record, but we did see you in court last week, Vaughn. So maybe just a word about that, because this case, I say this a lot, other people say this too, nothing is normal about this case, okay, nothing. And I'm sure we'll get into more reasons why that's true. But one aspect of this for us has been, we can't simply go to court and do our jobs. We have monitored the entire extradition proceedings. We're the only NGO that's managed to do so, because we weren't allowed to, and we had to fight our way in, and most were unable to. So this is at several courts now under two different sets of judges. So the first instance proceedings, District Judge Vanessa Beretzer decided that she was not going to recognize the role of professional NGO observers as being any different to the public. So we sought accreditation at each stage of these proceedings and were denied. We were told that we could queue for the public gallery. Of course, there were very few spaces made available, and this case is of tremendous public interest. So even in the first week in February 2020, before we had COVID restrictions in the mix, it was very difficult to get in. This was winter temperatures. This was queuing from 5 a.m. to get in for a 10 a.m. hearing. This is not how we're accustomed to do our jobs. We did it because it was really important that we were there. Then we had COVID restrictions in the mix as well. So it became extraordinarily difficult. In September, there were full 4 weeks plus, I think, of evidentiary proceedings, and sometimes only 2 people were allowed into the public gallery. So it frankly took a whole village, a community of activists, to help us get in each day. And I'm very grateful for everybody who ever queued and helped me get in, because I couldn't do it by myself every day. But we were able to get in for at least part of the proceedings every day. We were there for the decision, we were there for the bail hearing, and we were there last week again with some difficulty at a new court. It's always something different. Every single time it's a different way that we get in. Last week it was because we were added to the families list, and actually that was respected. In the past, that has not always been respected either. So we've probably got about, the most systematic view in terms of any NGO observers here, but nothing is normal. We shouldn't have to be fighting to even do our jobs.
Rebecca, why is that? I mean, is that a decision of the judge? Because you've covered trials all over the place. Is it a decision for the judge? Is it something particular in this country? I mean, what do you attribute it to?
There are some issues here, and let me be clear that some of this is probably incompetence, okay? Because I hear from journalists and others that there are difficulties in accessing certain trials here. This is not our experience in other countries, even with COVID restrictions in the mix. Last year, I have been to Malta a number of times where I've monitored murder proceedings related to the murder case of Daphne Caruana Galizia. I've been to Istanbul to monitor the murder case of Jamal Khashoggi there. So even other countries that have COVID restrictions in the mix, they recognize the role of professional NGO observers. They let us in to do our jobs. There's something about this system that isn't recognizing that and then becomes a bit combative with us. So the High Court being the most recent example. So I think a decision was made not to let Reporters Without Borders in because Amnesty International was allowed in. In previous proceedings, they were also, along with all NGOs, denied access. But this court, it was 2 weeks ago now, I keep saying last week, 2 weeks ago, allowed Amnesty International in. And I'm really glad that they were there. I think it's really important that other NGOs are also monitoring this. So let me be clear about that. But I have to ask why the only NGO that has been consistently monitoring the entire proceedings was not allowed that access. Then we got in, of course, with the family. But to even fight to have to do our jobs. And then, of course, we come to the substance of the case. So we've been very outspoken about our position. As Vaughn mentioned, none of us on this panel think that Julian Assange should spend a day in prison. He should never have spent a day in prison or in the embassy. We are documenting what we see. In addition to these barriers to open justice, we have a lot of substantive concerns about the case, of course. And so 2 weeks ago, the focus was really on these 5 grounds that the US government is currently being allowed to appeal on. And so we've ended up with such tunnel vision now because it's fully on mental health and prison conditions and, you know, really very expensive QCs arguing about whether Julian Assange will be able to override his suicidal impulses. We're not even arguing over whether he has suicidal impulses. It's accepted by everybody, right? They are gambling with his life. And we're failing, I think, to see the wood for the trees here, which is the case is about journalism. It's about press freedom. That's why we defend it. And that's why everybody should care, regardless of what one thinks about him as a person. And I personally find his situation heartbreaking, and what Stella and the kids are going through completely unacceptable from just a human perspective. But regardless of that, this is about the future of journalism internationally.
I want to pick up on this point that you both indicated, that what's happening to Julian is perhaps what not normally expected legally. Is Julian being treated equally under the law to how we might be treated? In what way is he not? I know some of the answers, but I
wouldn't know where to begin. He should never have been. He should never have been arrested in the first place. I mean, Julian was first arrested on the 7th of December 2010. This was WikiLeaks published the Cablegate on the 28th, 29th, depending on your time zone, of November 2010. On the 29th of November, Sweden issued an extradition request to Interpol the same day. Julian was never charged in Sweden throughout the 9 years that the preliminary investigation progressed. It's the most extraordinary thing. It's so counterintuitive that the prosecutor was evading an investigation, wasn't interested in speaking to him until the Swedish court compelled the prosecutor to question him after 6 years. No serious investigation. In no serious investigation does the investigator wait 6 years to speak to the suspect. But this allowed Julian to be initially incarcerated for 10 days, then under house arrest for 1.5 years, and then in the Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years, and then arrested and placed in Belmarsh high security prison. He hasn't been a free man since 7 days after he published Cablegate. Think about where you were on the 7th of December 2010. So this has been an extraordinary abuse of, it's very interesting if you look at it from the perspective of using the tools of the war on terror to persecute Julian. The European arrest warrant was similarly, it's a tool that falls under the same framework as the extradition to the US. Now it was negotiated in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. It basically fast-tracked suspects, fast-tracked defendants to be extradited within the European space and to the United States. And basically, they lost practically all ability to resist those kinds of extraditions. And of course, when they were initially negotiated, it was all about terrorism, but almost immediately that was abused. And we have, it was abused for as soon as these powers are introduced, they will be abused. And you have people who are extradited, during the UK's time in the EU to Poland for things like traffic fines and so on, and incarcerated and so on, because this was such a draconian legal climate. But that draconian legal climate has stayed, and every aspect of that climate and legal and political climate has now been deployed against Julian. And Julian is a signifier for journalism, because they're going after him because of what he published.
There's this very curious story about a Spanish security firm spying on the embassy, Ecuador embassy. What's all that about? Because it's actually been tried in Spain. Have I got that right? What's the story there, and what were they doing there?
What were they doing?
Did they spy on me when I went in there, do you think?
Probably.
Yes, they did. So Ecuador, the Ecuadorian embassy had a security firm, and because Ecuadorians couldn't get visas to work in the UK straightforwardly, they hired Spanish people. They spoke the language, who were able to work in the UK. And this was a corrupt security firm. The private security industry is notoriously corrupt because it's not an open market, and there's a lot of security theater. And the security firm started working for, through an American company, for an American company called Las Vegas Sands, which was owned by Trump's biggest financial backer. But internally in the firm, they were told by the CEO that they were working for the CIA. And working for the CIA, we know all this because when Julian was arrested, people who were working in this company turned whistleblowers because they found it completely unconscionable that they had been part of this. And they went initially to El País, and then they went to Spanish police, and they handed over a mass of hard drives and emails and so on. So it's very well documented. They were receiving instructions from the United States, targeting Julian's lawyers by name. It wasn't, that there were some CCTV cameras in the embassy. Yes, they were there, but they were secretly installed with audio recordings without telling the Ecuadorians. They were spying on Julian's legal meetings. They were taking recordings, physical recordings, hard drives, transporting them to the United States, handing them over. They were instructed with harvesting our baby's DNA. It was 6 months at the time. And when that happened, one of the security workers in the embassy took me aside outside the embassy and said, "Don't bring the baby in anymore because it's not safe. It's not safe, and they're asking us to do some very strange things." And I tried to get more information, but didn't get much. But he said, "Don't bring the baby in." And at that point, I realized that something really sinister and dangerous was going on. What we found out afterwards, once they had blown the whistle and gone to Spanish police, was that there were plots to poison Julian, plots to have him kidnapped from the embassy in a deniable way, like leave the door open, and then someone took him. We don't know what happened. And this is it's just incredible because we have the so-called Spanish case, which we've known about for 2 years, but we didn't know. We knew what they were saying, that they were working for the CIA. But then recently in September, there was this bombshell story, an incredibly well-sourced story. Over 30 sources, named and unnamed, high-level sources in the US government under Trump, current and former, and confirming that the CIA had tasked plans to assassinate Julian, to kidnap him.
But Trump, during his election campaign, Trump was saying how great Julian was, wasn't he? I mean, so it's quite bizarre, this whole thing.
I mean, Trump said lots of things. I mean, I find it very curious that some people decide to take Trump at his word on this one. The evidence is that under the Trump administration, at the highest levels of the Trump administration, there were talks to assassinate and kidnap Julian, and Julian was indicted under the Trump administration. An unprecedented attack on the press was taken under the Trump administration. The Trump administration was at war with the press and wanted to set this precedent, and they chose Julian to set this precedent.
Rebecca, you told us something quite interesting, but you were a diplomat in Baku.
Yes.
And
a
you
long
wrote
time ago.
a few cables, and they were leaked
I did.
by WikiLeaks.
So
Can you tell us about that? Because that's
yeah,
really interesting.
sure.
You've kind of been on both sides of this, haven't you?
So, well, not exactly, because I had left the State Department before this all happened,
Yeah.
but I mentioned it sometimes. It doesn't come up a lot, but I'm happy to talk about it. I was a diplomat very briefly at the start of my career, and like everybody else did, I wrote cables. So in Baku, I wrote probably 200 or so on human rights issues. And so my stuff was usually classified to protect sources. It wasn't particularly sensitive other than that. So by the time that Cablegate happened, I was already out of the State Department. I had moved to London, was working, for free expression NGOs at that point. And I've always supported the principles of this case from a free expression perspective. But I remember that moment of concern from my sources and sort of, some of the basis of some of the thinking that you hear, which I think has become really grotesque and convoluted over the years. But I think there are people who legitimately look at this at face value and think, okay, well, what about people that might have been put at risk? So I'll say from the cables that I wrote, I can't point to a single example of anybody who was harmed. There are people for sure that ended up in tough situations with their own government, people who maybe went to prison or were exiled over the years. None of them would point to WikiLeaks as playing a significant role in that. In fact, they had ongoing things. And many of them, in fact, if I were to call them right here, would be very supportive of this campaign and of what WikiLeaks did and what Julian Assange stands for and the campaigning that we're doing now. When you look at this on a bigger scale, the US government in 11 years now has still not presented any concrete evidence of any harm caused to a single person. So when you hear the legal arguments, and I've sat through all of this in court, when you hear their arguments, it's in a theoretical way that Julian Assange knowingly put sources at risk. When you hear the evidence of that, you see how publication was actually forced by a complicated series of events that was outside of WikiLeaks control. We heard evidence of Julian Assange taking steps to try to mitigate any risk caused to anybody. And we see that the US government is still not presenting any evidence of any harm caused. And in fact, we saw evidence of examples where the publication of this information helps human rights cases, such as Khalid al-Masri. So I think that argument has no real legs. And it's one of those sort of headline style things that many people believe to be true about this case that isn't true. And I find most people that are still hesitant here, if you actually have a one-on-one conversation, those people tend to believe things like that are simply not true about this case. I don't think I've ever worked on a case with so many layers of misperceptions, and I have to say intentional misperceptions. I think we need to look at why certain narratives have been promoted over the years. And as a campaigner, this is really challenging because most cases that we take up, we're trying to educate and inform the public and to mobilize people. You're trying to put a case on the map. This is much harder because almost everybody knows about this case. Almost everybody has an opinion, and we're mostly trying to change minds. But it's really important that we do try to change those minds. And I think it shows strength of character when people can reflect on their own positions, when we can acknowledge if we have internal biases or simply that we might have been led to believe something that wasn't true. Niels Meltzer has been incredibly powerful in this. He's the UN Special Rapporteur for Torture. So anybody who's having hesitations, I think read Niels Meltzer's interviews and his reporting on this. He spoke quite, I think, convincingly and openly about how, as a special rapporteur, how he was disinclined to take up this case, and then the reasons that he changed his mind. Because that's it. We need more people to change their minds now. It is going to affect the entire climate for journalism around the world.
Why do you think, Rebecca, that it's not being reported in the press, particularly in this country, in the way that perhaps it used to be? In the past, it was all over the papers, but now it's in court. You said very clearly how important it is as a case for freedom of expression and journalism rights, particularly in national security reporting. But we're not reading about it. Why?
Well, we should be. There is also more reporting than always meets the eye. I think there's some journalists who have really been diligently covering this the entire time. And if you peel away for this, if you go looking for it, all mainstream media organizations actually share the same position of Reporters Without Borders and free expression organizations like ours. They're maybe not as forthcoming as they should be. I believe that if this was happening in a case of this significance in any other part of the world, we probably see a bit of a different skew in the reporting on there. So that's one question that we ask, to media too. And I think it's more helpful to try to encourage people along instead of always making it sort of this battle between alternative and mainstream media. We need more voices on side. And so, I hope that editors will look at this and what happens next is of utmost importance. This is perhaps more important than anything to date, right? So I think now is the time, if there's been any reluctance to cover this openly, now is the time, especially as we learn of the decision of this court and see what happens next. And if the worst happens, if he is sent to the United States, the reporting that follows will be of utmost importance in convincing the public to care. If the public does not care in the US government will continue to get away with this. And what we are witnessing, to be very clear, and to go back to your earlier question about, is he being treated in the same way as anybody else? What we are witnessing is a political trial by countries that are not supposed to engage in this behavior. So that is very hard to accept. Most people, I think, in the US and UK have faith in our democratic institutions. We would like to. And when you start to accept some of the truths in this case, that calls into question some bigger, sinister things here. And I think a lot of people don't want to see that or don't want to accept that, but it's there.
There's a very senior judge now looking at it, isn't there? So that the High Court have got a very senior judge, or experienced judge, and he's trying to grapple with the fact that the Americans have made all sorts of guarantees and commitments. Do either of you trust those commitments?
Well, they're not commitments. I struggle to talk about it because I have to say the word assurances, and they're really non-assurances, or they're revocable assurances, or assurances at a minimum with inverted commas. Basically, what the US keeps on rebooting this case because it's a hopeless case. Their star witness recanted his testimony. The CIA plotted to kill
This the
Julian.
Icelandic bloke, is it?
Yeah.
He stayed in my house. He stole some of my hard disks, apparently. Just,
sold them to the FBI.
I should have a commission of some sort, you'd have thought.
He's in prison now, by the way.
Really? Well, serves him right, but stealing hard disks. Sorry, I
Okay, so
interrupted you.
These non-assurances, just to be clear, with the wording that the US has, so basically they lost in January, and then they said, oh, wait, now we have assurances. And so they submitted this document, and the document itself, first of all, there's something called SAMs in the US, Special Administrative Measures, which is a euphemism for extreme torture. And there's a supermax prison called ADX Florence, which is the deepest, darkest hole you can imagine, being buried alive there. And they say, they issued this document about SAMs, so the worst torture of isolation and burying you alive, and ADX Florence, and they say, well, now we say that we're not right now inclined to put him in those conditions of torture, but we can change our mind. So they can put him under SAMs and in ADX Florence without even violating their assurances. So what are these? We can't even talk about them as commitments or guarantees or assurances. Those assurances are that they can impose SAMs and ADX. So it's nothing at all. It is a reaffirmation of their position that they intend to torture Julian if they so choose.
Before I open it out to the floor and ask questions, the one thing I'd quite like you to outline, if you could please tell it, is, okay, the case, there's going to be a ruling, and then there are all sorts of ways it could go. What can you tell us about what Julian's future might be, depending on whether the judge says X or Y? Sorry, crystal ball slightly, but I just think people are quite keen to know, Julian will either be out of Belmarsh or he'll be in for how long before there's a resolution?
I think it's interesting now with this CIA story, because the UK courts are basically deciding on whether they can extradite Julian to the country that plotted to kill him.
Yeah.
This is the big picture, right? And they are confronted with it because we introduced this evidence in court in October, and they can't shy away from it. And this is something that will be hanging over the courts, whether we win or lose this round. So the UK courts now risk being seen to be complicit in, because it's in front of them. if the UK orders Julian's extradition and it could be fast, you know, it could be what they were capable of doing while Julian was inside the embassy shows the extent to which some elements of the state are willing to go. They were willing to rendition him from the United Kingdom. And in fact, around the time that he was arrested, there was a rendition jet, a US rendition jet in the UK. So I'm deeply worried about these sinister elements of the state that are capable of anything. And I do hope that the British courts take a strong position in denying this extradition and saying that the obvious, that this case is so abusive and the US government has gone way too far for any fair process to be possible. You know, like pick any element. Julian's legal papers were seized from the embassy when he was arrested and shipped off to the United States. 10 years of archive of minutes of meetings with his lawyers, of advice from his lawyers seized and shipped away. And he no longer has access to that. The country that's trying to extradite him, that plotted to kill him, has it. So what could happen? Well, it's very clear that if he's extradited, the UK would be extraditing him to his death. Julian's been in Belmarsh prison for 2.5 years, and they're killing him. They're slowly killing him. They didn't kill him in the embassy, but they're keeping this up, and they're killing him, you know. The longer this goes on, the harder it is for him to survive this. The Biden administration could drop this any day. And I do think the Biden administration says that it defends global press freedom, and that's a very obvious pressure point on them. If they do defend press freedom, they have to drop this case. The case is a major, the worst possible attack, central attack on the First Amendment. And the Espionage Act is worded so broadly that it could fatally undermine the First Amendment and press freedom and the whole culture of openness that exists in the US, which is much stronger than in this country. And I do think that there are many elements in the US administration who are deeply uncomfortable with this case ever reaching a US court. In the meantime, Julian is languishing in Belmarsh prison with this travesty playing out in the UK courts. And I hope that the UK courts at some point decide to distance themselves with this persecution and with this hounding and torturing of Julian, which is just getting worse and worse for every day that passes.
Thank you, Stella. We're going to open up for some questions. So if anyone's got a question, if you stick your hand up, we'll take a microphone around. No hands?
No.
Oh, yes, there's a hand there.
Hi, yeah, I've got a question about, it's clearly a political case and politically motivated, but to what extent can you separate the politics from the CIA or other elements of the state? And where do you think the levers or the pressure is from the American side to continue with this kind of prosecution?
Well, I mean, the fact that depending on which president is president of the US, Julian gets indicted or not, that's kind of an indicator. But that Yahoo story is very interesting because it talks about how Pompeo was, he was seen by some White House, I think the White House counsel or counsel to the NSC, or I can't remember exactly now, to be out to lunch with these plans. And that because Pompeo was progressing these plans to kidnap Julian at a minimum, but we know that the plans to kill him were explored at the implementation level by the Spanish security firm. So those, I think, are a lot more advanced than that piece actually admits. There were elements in the White House and then pressured the DOJ to bring a prosecution because they were talking about renditioning Julian, and they were saying, well, where are we going to rendition him? There's no case in the US, so we have to bring a case. That is, I mean, there couldn't be a clearer politically motivated prosecution than that. What happened when that case was published? Pompeo admitted that parts of it were true. And he also said that the sources for that story should be prosecuted. So he basically, the only way of prosecuting people, sources, is if they've violated the Espionage Act. Therefore, it was true. I think, the cat's out of the bag. You have to, in order for people to have some kind of faith in the independence of the legal system and the fairness and so on, you can't have that when you have assassination plots, rendition plots, the head of the CIA motivated by vengeance because of a publication that embarrassed the CIA. It's just completely incompatible. And I do think that there will just be more and more of these stories coming out because there's just been such an enormous, let's say it clearly, conspiracy to get Julian imprisoned, to silence him, and to try to bring down WikiLeaks. And that started in 2010, but it was definitely just became completely out of control in 2017 and 2018, and culminated in Julian's arrest in 2019. And thereby set a precedent that can be used against everyone else.
It's worth also remembering that the UK's role in this is also political. The UK made a political decision in 2019 to greenlight the extradition request. The Home Office could have taken a stand then and refused the request. This did not have to be a matter before the courts. That's how it's landed in court, was a political decision of this government. Also, Julian Assange was sentenced to a very disproportionate 50 weeks in prison for breaking bail, which I understand is unprecedented, and has held him ever since without charge, right? So these are all actions of the UK too. So I know the case is brought by the US, and our main advocacy calls currently are on the Biden administration, but the UK has played its own role here too. And I think here in London, we need to bear that in mind and hold our own authorities to account.
Is this the final step? Are there any other appeals that take place? And if the judge throws out the extradition appeal from the Americans, does Julian walk free?
It depends on how. Let's see, if the US loses, it can still appeal to the Supreme Court. It's not an automatic appeal, though. The Supreme Court would have to agree to hear it, and they would have to frame it in a way that is a point of general public importance, so not, attached to the specifics of this case. In that, if the Supreme Court rejected hearing the US appeal, then Julian could theoretically walk free. It depends a little bit on how that's decided, because I think the courts have a role in, as I said, distancing themselves And this case is just so beyond the pale that Julian's future safety, I think, depends a little bit on how the judges, in a scenario in which Julian wins, on what basis that's taken, how strongly they take that position. If Julian loses, then we're back to appealing all the political points. So we're back to publication. We're no longer talking about mental health and so on. We're back to, this is a political case, politically motivated. It's a frontal attack on Article 10, the European Convention of Human Rights, which is freedom of expression in the press. So it becomes quite a political, like the political issues become central again. And it can, become even more embarrassing for the Biden administration. So if they want to drop it, they should drop it sooner rather than later. And of course, if he wins here, but the Biden administration doesn't drop it, then anywhere that Julian goes could extradite him. So really, ultimately, what the Biden administration has to do is drop it because it's counterproductive. It's not in anyone's interests. It's not in the Biden administration's interests to have this Trump legacy case, which is extremely dangerous and divisive, and which all the press freedom and civil liberties groups in the US oppose.
We've got a question from the gentleman in the white shirt, and then another one from the lady in the red jumper.
I live in southeast London, and over the last 2.5 years, I've been down to Belmarsh to join the protest there. My question about this is why has it been so difficult to get traction for this campaign amongst ordinary people and organisations for it? Because the facts has been laid out are pretty clear. And I think we are getting more traction now, but it has proved to be very difficult.
Extremely difficult. So I touched on it a bit earlier. I think I really think that it's because of these layers of misinformation that are shared in the case and this sort of concerted effort to portray Julian Assange as this unlikable figure. If people do not feel sympathetic about it, they won't speak out. And that's what's allowed our governments, and I say this as a dual national US, UK, our governments to behave in the way that they have. But again, we have to look at why and how this has all been done. And again, I've not seen anything like it in any other case, at least not to this extent. I also have to say, it worked for a number of years, sort of in creating division among even those who should support him, among some human rights organizations, among some in the media. I think that support has come back around to him. I feel again now very solid that there is a big community behind us now on the principles of this case, but that divide and conquer approach can be very effective. I can't think of another case that we work on in any part of the world where so much focus is put on somebody's personality or on whether or not that person should be liked or is deserving of this support, right? It's usually about the merits, and it should be in this case and every single case that we work on too.
I do want to add that it's not coincidental. There's been a deliberate campaign to dehumanize Julian, to make him, turn him into someone that he isn't. If you look at the reporting in 2010, it was like rock star, magnetic, charismatic, etc. We're dealing with very sophisticated enemies of Julian who have are practiced in shaping narrative. And I think we've all learned a lot about how easy it is in the era of the internet, social media, to demonize people and to basically to spark this vicious, dangerous instinct that the herd has. And to try to direct it at certain people. And that's undeniably what has been done to Julian. I mean, there are studies about this. The type of smear campaign of vicious attacks against Julian, of turning every single little thing in order to dehumanize him, was a staging to get him arrested, to reduce support, to make him look alone. How many articles were there? Everyone's abandoned Julian and he has no friends. And there was nothing further from the truth, but this would be published uncontested. You wondered, where the hell does this come from? But you know, so we're not dealing with a neutral baseline here. We're dealing with forces that are deliberately counteracting support. And so, you know, yes, let's acknowledge it's been difficult over the years. I think support has grown immensely, and there's a lot of support now. All the major organizations, mainstream support. But there's been an enormous propaganda effort, and we need to acknowledge it. This didn't come from Julian. It came from external forces trying to dehumanize Julian in order to silence him.
Next question is from the lady in the red jumper, and then the gentleman in the house.
Thanks very much. I got two questions, one of them for everybody. Is there any element of this whole saga which has any precedent that you can look at and cite? And the second question is really for Rebecca. I mean, you talked about the why this case hasn't gained the traction you might have expected in the UK, and you asked on the matter of sort of smear campaigns, propaganda. You also alluded to the fact that the system in the UK is maybe less open, less amenable to this sort of thing. The court system is in a particular way. I wondered whether you could talk a bit more about that.
Sure. Do you want to take the first bit, or?
I mean, I think there are many precedents because, you know, the risk when you talk about precedents is that I mean, in this country, Oscar Wilde, Dreyfus, Aristotle. I mean, it's a pattern. Julian's, the attacks on Julian have been equivalent to his significance, his impact. Like the enormous counter attack just is a testimony to how significant his impact has been, and you have that with. I mean, the word dissident is. I mean, he's a critic. He's a critic of Western. Many aspects of Western policy, but he's also a great admirer of the pillars of Western democracy. And that's why he's so dangerous, because he's dangerous to certain elements who undermine democracy. Because he's strengthened accountability, he's strengthened transparency, he's strengthened the ability to hold criminals who have the color of the state. When crimes are committed by state authorities, they're still crimes. And when Wikileaks published these publications in 2010, there were a lot of crimes that still have to be tried in court, and they won't be tried in court. And as long as those crimes go untried, they had to divert attention and then prosecute him, because otherwise the question remains, why haven't you put those people who were manning the helicopter that gunned down those innocents in Baghdad on trial? Why? Why are those war criminals not on trial? Well, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about Julian Assange.
In terms of precedent, it's not exactly the same, but I think a lot about what happened to Daniel Ellsberg, the leaker of the Pentagon Papers. And of course, that's different because he leaked, he didn't publish, right? And so Julian Assange is being targeted for publishing, which is another level of why this is alarming. But I found Daniel Ellsberg's testimony in the evidentiary portion of proceedings in September really powerful. He is really, and he's been outspoken on the case beyond, just the evidence as well. He denies any sort of efforts to portray the Pentagon Papers as a good leak and WikiLeaks as bad. He views what he did and what WikiLeaks has done as one and the same, because it's all about transparency and information, right? And he said, I can't remember if this was in the testimony or at another event, but he said he was told you'll have blood on your hands, and they were wrong. I think that's really poignant when you look at the situation now. And in my own experience, I think I mentioned this to you on the sidelines of the hearing the other week, Stella, but the only thing that I could draw on that was in any way similar was a case I was monitoring in Turkey. Can Dündar, he was the editor of Cumhuriyet newspaper, who's now living in exile abroad, but he's still being pursued in absentia by Turkey on national security related charges. And I've sat in a courtroom there on the Silivri prison campus on about 45 minutes outside Istanbul, and listened to the most absurd set of accusations about this wonderful person that I've gotten to know pretty well, that we've done quite a lot with at Reporters Without Borders, just these absurd charges that have no grounding in reality. And he's being tried in absentia there, not able to speak, not able to defend himself. Just as Julian can't participate in his own proceedings. He wasn't even in court. We don't know why he wasn't allowed to come to court. He requested to be in court, right? There are a lot of parallels there. The difference is that Can Dündar is safe. He is in exile abroad. He is being protected by the German government, whereas Julian Assange is being equally persecuted by the state in which he lived. To your other question, I think, honestly, I think some of this is part of what we're seeing unfold in other ways politically now here at the moment. I'm an outsider in this country. I grew up in the US. I've lived here for about 12 years now. So I've really, most of my adult life, and I've really engaged in the system here, but I think I approach things in a bit of a different way. I'm still surprised sometimes how many things are done by tradition and by this sort of acceptance that of course everybody's honest, of course everybody's acting in good faith. We're seeing now with the sleaze and all of these stories coming out in Parliament now that actually we can't just take the good old chat, what was it, the old chap system of of government here. We cannot just take these things at face value. I feel almost like that a bit in the court system, that there's this resistance to even of course these proceedings wouldn't need monitoring, right? Because our judiciary is above reproach. No judicial system anywhere is above reproach. It should always send scrutiny. This is a country that is committed to the principles of open justice, the right to fair trial, and everything that's happening here should be publicly viewable. It shouldn't be a few people jostling, at the public gallery interest to get in. Anybody who wants to see this should be able to. So it shouldn't even just be a matter for us. Literally every single person on this planet who has an interest in these these proceedings that are of tremendous public interest should be able to watch this. Some countries put these things on live television. Why is it being hidden here? These are questions that I have, but I think to me it feels a bit like that. Our system, of course, will do what it is meant to do, and it will work properly and doesn't need this kind of scrutiny.
The gentleman in the hat.
This is maybe for Rebecca first, though we welcome Stella's journalistic knowledge as well. That the journalist Craig Murray, who reported until very recently on the Julian Assange case, and indeed was a witness in the Spanish case against the UC Global, do you think his conviction in Scotland was somewhat related to his work he'd done on the Assange case and his ability to do court reporting under very, very difficult circumstances, as you've described earlier?
So we have condemned Craig Murray's sentencing. I think it is appalling that in the United Kingdom that we have a blogger in prison. I think the case is a little complicated and most free expression organizations haven't commented on it, I think for those reasons, but we have, because I think it's important that we take a stand on all of these cases, whether it's in our democracies or in the worst offenders in other places, right? I will take Craig's case at face value. There are journalists are obliged to follow court rules, right? So it becomes more difficult to get into the specific accusations here. What we have said is similar to actually Craig's own defense, which is that it was disproportionate and that alternative measures should have been considered. So that's what I would say here. We've taken up various contempt of court cases around the world. It's a bit different when there's a very, very clear public interest defense. I think the things that have been brought into this case are a bit trickier for us to sort of get into in that way, but it is certainly disproportionate and Craig Murray shouldn't be in prison. We call again for his release.
Actually, there was the lady in the, yes, first, and then the gentleman in front. Yeah.
I just had a couple of questions. I mean, and one of them may not be very possible to answer, but I wanted to ask about whether you pick up any impression of the nature of the healthcare or medical attention that Assange receives in Belmarsh. And the second question is really exactly why is he there? Is he on remand? What category of prisoner is he? I really find that very, very difficult to understand.
He's a remand prisoner, and I haven't in terms of his the medical attention in Belmarsh is insufficient, and you know, really dependent on the availability of the medical staff. Some people just come certain days once a week. Sometimes they don't come and there's no substitute. I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't want to violate Julian's privacy, but it's lacking, and there is a lot of concern that he's not getting the care that he needs access to. In terms of Belmarsh itself, yeah, I mean, he shouldn't be in prison at all. He needs to be released, really. I want to emphasize that what's needed is his release, because if we're talking about which prison he should be in, it's like saying that that becomes the argument.
We condemned the decision to leave him detained as unnecessarily cruel. And it's really grotesque if you consider that the same court 2 days prior issued a decision against extradition on the basis of the very mental health issues that will be exacerbated in any period of prolonged detention, whether in the UK, the US, Australia, anywhere else. So that was a decision taken here in this country, which I find really appalling. And as Stella mentioned, he shouldn't be in prison anywhere. I also was really concerned to hear repeatedly throughout the evidentiary portion, I think willful misinterpretations about very serious mental health issues and neurodiversity. I think all of these things are at play here. Perhaps some is a lack of understanding, but from the prosecution, which is of course the US government, it really seems to be a willful misinterpretation of these things, which is not okay in 2021.
The gentleman in front had a
Hey. So to Rebecca, I was wondering if you happen to know if, like, just as a matter of course, other legal cases in the British court system have reduced their public access like spaces so dramatically, like 40 public spaces to 5 or something on the grounds of coronavirus, or if it's been different with Julian's case. And then I was wondering to Stella, in the appeal, is it like the Isikoff story seems to have been like allowed to be brought in, and it was allowed to be cited, but it seems like the Siggy story in Iceland was not. And is it because that was considered new evidence? And then if so, is it because it's sort of like to refute the credibility of the US assurances that the reason that the Isikoff story is deemed relevant in the plots to murder, why was one allowed and the other not?
What was the first question again?
On court access?
Yeah.
Shall I,
Other
that's easy.
cases
Shall I
compared to
get that one
Julian's.
out of the way, or do you want to do
No,
Isikoff
no.
first? The other cases that I've monitored here, I've not had this trouble getting into, but they were not sort of as of tremendous international attention. No, to be honest, I'm trying to think. I don't think I've been into another courtroom in the UK during this period, but I have heard from journalists who cover trials. I mean, I think there are problems across the board. There are other open justice issues in this country. It's just really put in the spotlight for this case in particular. And again, it's of such tremendous public interest. Most of us were writing to the court weeks, if not months in advance, seeking access. They could have foreseen this. They could have made better plans. At every stage, it was a different set of obstacles. It was always evolving. Sometimes it was even different depending on who was the court official sort of at the door, right? They should have managed it better, and they had every opportunity to do so. And it was completely predictable that it would be the situation. What it felt to me, and I've documented this, those who follow on Twitter, I have many Twitter rants about all of these access issues. At some point, I'll put it all in one place because honestly, nobody would believe the full extent of it. But what it felt like to me was, again, some of it could be incompetence, but it was too much to where some of it was not deliberate, and it felt like a concerted attempt to make it as difficult to follow proceedings as possible and as physically uncomfortable, I have to say. So that's where we are in the UK in 2021.
In relation to the, as you say, Isikoff story, this is a Yahoo story about the CIA kill, murder, rendition, kidnap, propaganda plots. The reason it was able to be introduced is because it directly connected with the US assurances. The Thordarson star witness recantation of testimony, which goes to the indictment itself and the ruling itself, that was not up for argument at the appeal. There were very narrow issues for argument, but one of those issues was the so-called non-assurances, right? And the way it connects is that the agencies that will determine whether Julian is put in isolation, in extreme isolation, whether it's SAMS or ADX or any other form of isolation, which the US has not referred to in their assurances. Now, the US has a barbaric prison system. On any given day, 80,000, that's 80,000 people are estimated to be in solitary confinement. We're talking about, when they're talking about SAMS and ADX, they're talking about a subset, very concrete type of isolation, but it's all solitary confinement. Just for your reference, out of those 80,000, just 50 are under SAMS, and just 500 are in ADX Florence. So the remaining 79,500 people in solitary confinement are not under ADX or SAMS. So the US could easily put Julian in solitary confinement without it being under that rubric. So that's what we're saying. We're saying these assurances are, not only are they not assurances, they're irrelevant, because those are conditions that would drive him to take his life, because they're torturous. Sorry, back to your question. The agencies that can determine Julian's level of isolation based on national security grounds are the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, and so on. Now, you have the agency that plotted to kill Julian, who is the one that is going to give the recommendation to the Attorney General about how Julian should be held in a US prison. So that's where the connection was legally. In terms of the star witness, it blows a major hole in the US indictment. That's because basically what the US government did in order to sell this indictment was say, oh no, it has a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act component. Sometimes they say hacking, but hacking doesn't have any legal significance, like it's not a legal term. It's just a PR term. So they had this computer element and they pegged it because it was so weak in relation to the Chelsea Manning allegations. They say themselves, it's circumstantial evidence. The purpose of, anyway, without getting too technical, they say it's circumstantial evidence in relation to Chelsea Manning. And the defense's expert blew a hole through their whole Chelsea Manning allegation back in February 2020 in the first part of the extradition hearing. So they issued a new indictment. And the only thing they introduced with the new indictment was this star witness to try to shore up the computer charge, the single computer charge, as again, a propaganda effort. And that all those allegations have been now recanted by that witness. So it's a major component, like their PR charge has been completely obliterated by their own witness. But we haven't been able to introduce that yet.
So the non-CFAA accounts don't really rely on Siggy at all.
They do. He's central to the CFAA single count.
Non-CFAA accounts.
No, because they're just about receiving information from a journalistic source, communicating, which they call conspiracy, with a source, possessing information from a journalistic source, and communicating that to the public. It's the pure, they needed that computer charge in order to sell the Espionage Act charges, because those are purely journalistic. It's their PR, they're sugarcoating.
We've got any more questions? We've got one at the back there.
Before my question, I'm just want to say that Julian Assange's case, it's a personal case for me, because I know well the feeling of a government asking another government for your extradition regarding your journalism work. I presented audio leaks regarding the president of Egypt since 2015. So I know this feeling well. So I fully support with you, Stella, and with Assange. My question is, I think we don't have enough time. You said the court will say that the last word within 2 or 3 weeks. What do you say for journalists, for NGOs, for mainstream media here in the UK who want to do something for Assange? Thank you.
It's not too late to speak out now. Judges are people too. They see information in the media. They see all of these things out there. It's not too late for people to add their voice to this now as deliberations continue. Regardless of what happens next, there will still be a fight. Even if the decision is upheld, there are many hurdles that could still be thrown here. I mean, the court could leave him in detention as the US continues to pursue an appeal, et cetera. We need more voices speaking out for his immediate release and then the principles at stake. And regardless of what happens next, I think we need more solidarity in campaigning to ensure that this can never happen to anyone again. So we need to reform the legislation that is allowing for this to happen. We need a public interest defense in the US Espionage Act. We need a public interest defense in the UK Official Secrets Act. We're waiting for now the Home Office to table an extremely problematic piece of legislation that we know is coming that could see journalists in this country easily classed as spies and jailed for up to 14 years simply for receiving leaked information, not even publishing. This is happening in the UK today. There are laws in other countries around the world. I think we need a moment where we take stock of how this happened, why it was successful, at least to date, and to ensure that that the media, that the free expression community, that the human rights communities come together and ensure that that others cannot be made an example of in this way.
I'd say there needs to be much more engagement with this case, and it has to be looked at afresh. People think they know what this case is about, but they don't. What was going through the courts last year in the magistrates court, the US was arguing that journalists can be prosecuted for receiving and publishing classified information in this country too. Now, this is something that hasn't been tested in this country until now, and the judge accepted that on principle that is correct. So what we're discussing about the serious threats to press freedom through these reforms to the Official Secrets Act have already been discussed in UK courts. This case is precedent setting here as well. It's extremely dangerous, and I think there's been a complacency and kind of a bit of a old boys club dynamic where the position of some journalists has been, well, he's not like us, so we don't have to defend him. The problem is that they're going after him in a way that sets a precedent against other journalists. They're prosecuting him as a journalist, not as a source. And it's unprecedented. And precisely because of this counterproductive selfish, trying to distance themselves from Julian, they don't see that the legal attack is on journalism. It's not on Julian Assange, born in Australia, founder of WikiLeaks. The precedent is the principle that is established that then can be used against everyone else. And in the US, and it's not, there are elements in the UK, just like in the US, who have been wanting this for decades. They want a precedent set so that they can be able to prosecute, when they so choose, the most courageous journalists who publish the most inconvenient truths. And that's in this country as well. So it has to be looked at afresh. It has to be argued on the principle. British journalists have to stop this ridiculous, I'm sorry, cowardly, he's a terrible person, I don't like him. It doesn't matter. And if it doesn't matter, just shut up about it. Just argue the principle, defend press freedom. And if you want to attack his character, do it once he's free, rather than contribute to his persecution by reaffirming these narratives that have been dehumanizing him out of principle. I'm not saying like him, I'm saying shut up about it and defend him because he's being persecuted and because it's freedom of the press that is being persecuted. And if this succeeds, we're all fucked.
Well, I was going to just ask one more question. Had Kristen been here, I was going to ask him, observe something about the whole WikiLeaks. And I'm wondering, Rebecca, if you could help. What is the contribution today from all these revelations that have come out through WikiLeaks that Julian was involved in? Because we're not seeing them credited. How much journalism today is being informed by this work?
Not just this work, but the model that WikiLeaks started. I mean, this was 11 years ago. WikiLeaks and what they did and what they continue to do has in many ways changed the face of journalism in ways that younger journalists might not even realize kind of started with this. There are still stories, in fact, being published on the basis of this leaked information. If you look at how much journalism throughout the world was based on this, I mean, it's really immeasurable. And so we then have to ask again why the only person put on trial here is the publisher. None of we know about war crimes, we know about human rights abuses. This is all well documented. Nobody has been pursued except for Julian Assange.
We've got time for one more question if anyone's got a burning one.
I'm a lawyer and I've got experience with the Court of Protection here. And if anyone has any mental incapacity, that person can get enormous relief from the Court of Protection, which in fact takes over all their legal affairs and makes directions in regard to their care, control and custody. I commend that jurisdiction and power to those advising Julian Assange.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to finish off with, Stella, you and Julian were going to try and get married. Why have they stopped that? I simply don't understand it. What on earth reasons are they given for that?
Well, they haven't given any reasons. And it's a completely unjustifiable interference. We've been making inquiries since May. Julian himself put in a formal request on the 7th of October. His solicitors started chasing on the 14th of October. We scheduled in a visit with the registrar so that we could give notice last Wednesday. And the first response, well, we had some holding responses before that, but the afternoon before the registrar was supposed to come in, we got a letter saying that they had referred the matter to the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service.
What have they got to do with marriage?
Well, they represent the US, but there's a clear conflict of interest as the CPS should have anything to do with deciding on whether we can get married in Belmarsh. I don't know what they're up to, and it's just weird and sinister that there should be any delay to allowing us to just get the process in motion, because we haven't even been able to get the process in motion, because first you need to give notice to the registrar. So, it's one of those things. That's what prison is like. I don't know if any of you are familiar with prisons. I wasn't, but they control every single detail, everything. You have no control over anything. You're at their mercy, basically. I don't blame the prison, because I think that anything to do with Julian, anything like this, is being referred up the channels, and but it's no one's business up the channels whether we get married or not. And I'm deeply angered that even this is being interfered with. And, I hope they reverse course. And that's why we've taken this legal action, because, I'm not just going to sit by and wait for their timing or their decisions, or they've already delayed us. They had plenty of notice, and it's completely unconscionable and unjustifiable. And I hope that we'll get a decision soon. With the press attention there's been, people are outraged, and I think people are happy that we want to get married and want to see it happen. So,
well, I simply can't begin to understand it, and I'm sure none of us can. We've used up our time. It's come to an end. I'd like to thank the audience for all your excellent questions. I'd like to thank Rebecca and Stella for coming here on behalf of all of you. Thank you.